Captain Sarah Martinez had always known she was different from the other Marines at camp. At 5 feet 4 inches tall with a slight frame, she stood out among the towering figures in desert camouflage who dominated the base. But what really set her apart wasn't her size. It was her determination to prove herself in a world where respect had to be earned through blood, sweat, and unwavering courage. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac as Sarah walked toward the CH-53E Super Stallion helicopter that would become her office, her battlefield, and sometimes her sanctuary. She had spent 3 years working her way up from second lieutenant to captain, and now she was finally getting her chance to lead her own aviation unit. The smell of jet fuel and the distant sound of rotor blades filled the air, creating a symphony that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. "Well, well, look who's trying to play with the big boys," came a voice from behind her. Sarah didn't need to turn around to know it belonged to Captain Mike Thunder, a fellow pilot who had made it his personal mission to remind her that she didn't belong here. Mike was everything the Marines seemed to want in an officer: tall, broad-shouldered, with a voice that could boom across a parade ground and a swagger that suggested he owned every room he entered. Sarah had encountered men like Mike throughout her military career. They saw her gender as a weakness, her size as a liability, and her presence as an unwelcome intrusion into their exclusive brotherhood. She had learned early on that responding to their taunts with anger only gave them more ammunition. Instead, she had developed a strategy of quiet competence, letting her actions speak louder than any words ever could. "Morning," she replied without breaking stride, her voice calm and professional. She could hear his heavy footsteps as he quickened his pace to catch up with her. "Heard they're giving you a call sign today," Mike continued, falling into step beside her. "Should be interesting to see what they come up with for someone like you." Call signs were a sacred tradition in military aviation. They weren't chosen by the pilots themselves, but were earned through actions, mistakes, or memorable incidents. Some were heroic, others embarrassing, but all were permanent markers of a pilot's identity within the squadron. Sarah had been flying for 2 years without an official call sign, operating under her last name while she proved herself worthy of something more permanent. The assignment briefing was scheduled for 800 hours in the squadron ready room, a cramped space filled with mismatched chairs, outdated coffee, and walls covered in squadron patches, mission photos, and safety reminders. As Sarah entered the room, conversations gradually died down. She could feel eyes following her as she found a seat near the back, close enough to hear everything but far enough away to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. Lieutenant Colonel James Hawk stood at the front of the room, his weathered face bearing the lines of someone who had seen combat in 3 different countries. Hawk was old-school military, a man who believed in tradition, discipline, and earning your place through action rather than words. He had been Sarah's commanding officer for 6 months, and while he had never openly supported her, he had never actively worked against her either. "All right, listen up," Hawk's voice cut through the remaining chatter. "We've got a situation developing in Afghanistan. Intelligence suggests there's a hostage rescue operation in the works, and they're going to need our best pilots for extraction support." Sarah's pulse quickened. This was the kind of mission she had trained for, the reason she had joined the Marines in the first place. Growing up in a small town in Texas, she had watched her older brother deploy to Iraq and had heard his stories about the pilots who risked everything to bring wounded soldiers home. Those stories had planted a seed that eventually grew into an unshakable determination to serve her country in the same way. "Captain Martinez," Hawk's voice pulled her from her thoughts, "you'll be flying lead support on this one." The room fell silent. Flying lead support meant being responsible not just for her own aircraft and crew, but for coordinating with multiple other helicopters in what would likely be a complex and dangerous operation. It was a position typically reserved for the most experienced pilots, and Sarah had never been given that level of responsibility before. Mike's laugh broke the silence. "Sir, with all due respect, don't you think this mission might be a little too complex for—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words that wouldn't get him in trouble with his commanding officer. "For what, Captain?" Hawk's voice carried a warning edge. "Well, sir, Captain Martinez hasn't exactly had the experience level that this kind of operation typically requires." Sarah felt her face flush, but she kept her expression neutral. She had learned long ago that showing emotion in these situations only made things worse. Instead, she focused on her breathing and waited to see how Hawk would respond. "Captain Martinez has logged more flight hours in the past 6 months than any other pilot in this squadron," Hawk replied coolly. Her performance ratings are consistently in the top 10%, and she's completed advanced combat maneuvering training with distinction. Unless you have specific concerns about her qualifications, I suggest you focus on preparing for your own role in this mission. The rebuke was gentle but firm, and Mike's face reddened as he realized he had overstepped. But Sarah could see in his eyes that this wasn't over. If anything, her selection for this important mission had only intensified his resentment. Now, Hawk continued, about call signs, we have several pilots who've been operating without official designations, and it's time to rectify that situation. He picked up a folder from his desk and opened it. Captain Martinez, your call sign will be Sticky 6. The room erupted in barely suppressed snickers. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she processed the implications of the name. Sticky could mean any number of things, most of them unflattering. In aviation, it might refer to someone who had trouble with landings or who found themselves in difficult situations they couldn't get out of easily. The number 6 was simply her position in the squadron's organizational structure, but combined with sticky, it sounded like a polite way of calling her incompetent. Mike's grin was visible from across the room. Sticky 6, he repeated under his breath, loud enough for several nearby pilots to hear. That's perfect. Sarah felt the familiar burn of humiliation in her chest, but she forced herself to remain composed. Thank you, sir, she said to Hawk, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. As the briefing continued with details about the upcoming mission, Sarah's mind raced. She had worked so hard to prove herself, to earn the respect of her peers and superiors. Now she was stuck with a call sign that seemed to mock all of her efforts. But beneath the embarrassment and frustration, something else was growing. A fierce determination to show everyone in that room exactly what Sticky 6 was capable of. The mission briefing revealed that they would be supporting a Navy SEAL team attempting to extract a captured journalist from a Taliban compound in Afghanistan's Helmand province. The operation would require precise timing, exceptional flying skills, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Sarah would be flying the lead CH-53E, responsible for inserting the SEAL team and providing extraction support if things went wrong. As the other pilots filed out of the ready room, making jokes about call signs and mission assignments, Sarah remained in her seat, studying the mission parameters on her tablet. She had 3 days to prepare for what could be the most important flight of her career, and her first real chance to prove that Sticky 6 was more than just a joke. Mike lingered near the door, clearly waiting for an opportunity to twist the knife a little deeper. Don't worry, Sticky, he said with false sympathy. I'm sure you'll do just fine. Try not to get too stuck on the details. Sarah looked up from her tablet and met his gaze directly. I'll keep that in mind. Something in her voice must have surprised him, because his confident smirk faltered for just a moment. But then he recovered and walked away, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and her new call sign. That evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment off base, surrounded by flight manuals and mission planning documents. Her phone buzzed with a text from her brother David, who was now a civilian working as an engineer in Houston. How's military life treating you, little sister? She stared at the phone for a long moment, considering how to respond. She could tell him about the call sign, about Mike's constant harassment, about how sometimes she wondered if she was fighting a battle she could never win. Instead, she typed back, getting ready for an important mission. Wish me luck. You don't need luck, came his immediate reply. You've got skill and heart. That's better than luck any day. Sarah smiled for the first time since leaving the briefing room. David was right. She didn't need luck. She had trained for this moment her entire career, and she was ready to show everyone what Sticky 6 really meant. But first, she had to survive the most dangerous mission of her life. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation and planning. Sarah threw herself into every aspect of the mission with an intensity that surprised even her. She studied satellite photos of the target compound until she could navigate its layout in her sleep. She reviewed weather patterns, calculated fuel consumption rates, and ran through emergency procedures until her crew chief started joking that she knew the helicopter better than the engineers who built it. Her crew consisted of 2 men who had initially been skeptical about flying with her. Staff Sergeant, her crew chief, was a 20-year veteran who had seen more combat than most officers twice his age. Corporal Williams, her door gunner, was young and eager but still learning to trust his instincts in high-stress situations. Both men had requested transfers when they first learned they would be working with a female pilot. But Sarah had gradually won them over through consistent professionalism and an unwavering commitment to their safety. "Captain, you sure you're not overthinking this?" asked on the second day as he found Sarah in the hangar at midnight, going over maintenance logs for the third time. "We've run through every possible scenario twice already." Sarah looked up from the paperwork spread across a tool cart she was using as a makeshift desk. "I want to make sure we're ready for anything, Sergeant. This isn't just any mission." Nodded, understanding more than she realized. He had seen plenty of pilots let pressure get to them, and he had also seen what happened when preparation met opportunity. "You know, ma'am, I've been flying with Marine pilots for 15 years. The best ones aren't the ones who never make mistakes. They're the ones who prepare so well that when mistakes happen, they know how to handle them." His words carried more weight than he probably intended. Had a reputation for being brutally honest with officers, regardless of their rank or gender. If he was offering encouragement instead of criticism, it meant something. Meanwhile, Mike was making sure everyone on base knew about Sarah's new call sign. He had taken to using it loudly in the mess hall, always with just enough respect in his tone to avoid official reproach, but with enough underlying mockery to get his point across. "Hey, Sticky Six," he called out during lunch on the second day. "Heard you're still in the hangar studying. Don't want to get stuck on something important, right?" Sarah had developed a strategy for dealing with Mike's comments. She would acknowledge him with a brief nod and continue whatever she was doing, never giving him the reaction he was looking for. But inside, each comment was like a small cut, and she could feel them accumulating despite her best efforts to ignore them. The breakthrough came on the third day during a training exercise. The squadron was practicing close formation flying in preparation for the mission, with 4 helicopters working together to simulate the actual operation. Sarah was flying lead, with Mike in the number 2 position, when sudden weather moved in from the west. What had started as a routine training flight quickly became a test of skill and judgment as visibility dropped and wind speeds increased. "Lead, this is 2, Mike's voice crackled over the radio. "Recommend we head back to base. This weather's getting too thick for safe formation flying." Sarah checked her instruments and looked out at the rapidly deteriorating conditions. The smart move, the safe move, would be to follow Mike's suggestion. But something inside her rebelled against the idea of giving him another reason to question her judgment. "2, this is lead," she replied calmly. "We're continuing the exercise. Tighten up your formation and follow my lead." For the next 20 minutes, Sarah guided the formation through weather conditions that pushed every pilot to their limits. She adjusted their altitude to find clearer air, modified their route to avoid the worst of the turbulence, and maintained constant communication with her fellow pilots to ensure everyone stayed safe. When they finally landed back at base, the other pilots were quiet, processing what they had just experienced. Mike was the first to speak after they shut down their engines. "That was," he paused, seeming to struggle for words. "That was some impressive flying, Martinez." It was the first time he had used her name instead of her call sign in months, and Sarah noticed the difference immediately. "Thank you. Good formation work on your part, too." But the real test was yet to come. The next morning brought final briefings for the actual mission. Intelligence had confirmed that the captured journalist was being held in a compound approximately 30 miles northeast of their forward operating base in Afghanistan. The rescue would require precise timing. Sarah would insert the SEAL team under cover of darkness, then remain on station to provide immediate extraction if the operation went wrong. Colonel gathered the flight crews for a final briefing at 500 hours. The ready room was more crowded than usual, with intelligence officers, communications specialists, and medical personnel all packed into the small space. The gravity of the situation was evident in everyone's faces. This wasn't a training exercise or a routine mission. Lives were hanging in the balance. "The target is a compound consisting of 3 buildings arranged in a rough triangle," the intelligence officer began, pointing to a large satellite photo projected on the wall. "Our asset is believed to be held in the central building, which is also where most of the hostile forces are concentrated." Sarah studied the photo intently, noting the positions of potential landing zones, the layout of nearby roads, and the proximity of other buildings that could complicate the operation. The compound was situated in a valley surrounded by rocky hills that would limit their approach and escape routes. "Captain Martinez's voice drew her attention. You'll be taking the SEAL team in at 200 hours local time. The approach will be from the south, using the ridge line to mask your approach until the last possible moment. Sarah nodded, already visualizing the flight path in her mind. The approach described would require flying at extremely low altitude through mountainous terrain in complete darkness. It was exactly the kind of challenging flying that separated good pilots from great ones. "What's the backup plan if the primary landing zone is compromised?" she asked. "There are two alternate sites," replied, pointing to locations on the map. "But both are significantly further from the target, which would increase the time the SEALs are on the ground." The implication was clear. The primary landing zone was dangerous, but the alternatives were worse. Sarah would need to get it right the first time. The SEAL team leader, a weathered chief petty officer named Masters, spoke up next. "Captain, my boys need 60 seconds on the ground to get into position. Can you guarantee us that much time in the primary zone?" Sarah met his eyes directly. "Chief, I can guarantee you'll have as much time as you need. Sticky 6 doesn't leave anyone behind." It was the first time she had used her call sign voluntarily, and something about the way she said it made the room fall silent. There was no trace of embarrassment or apology in her voice. Instead, there was a quiet confidence that seemed to transform the meaning of the name entirely. Mike, sitting across the room, felt something shift in his perception of Sarah Martinez. The woman who spoke those words wasn't the uncertain pilot he had been tormenting for months. This was someone who had found her strength and was ready to use it. The final hours before departure passed quickly. Sarah completed her pre-flight inspection with methodical precision, checking every system twice and ensuring that her crew was ready for whatever they might encounter. And Williams had transformed over the past few days, their initial skepticism replaced by genuine respect for their pilot's preparation and professionalism. "You know what, Captain?" Williams said as he test-fired his door gun into a sand berm. "I used to think that call sign was kind of a joke, but now I'm thinking maybe it means something different." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Well, when things get tough, when everyone else wants to run or give up, you stick around. You stick with your crew, you stick with the mission. Maybe that's not such a bad thing to be known for." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest. For months, she had seen Sticky 6 as a burden, a reminder that she didn't quite fit in with the other pilots. But Williams was right. There were worse things to be known for than loyalty and persistence. As the sun set over camp, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Sarah sat in her helicopter and went through her final mental preparation. In a few hours, she would be flying into hostile territory with the lives of both her crew and the SEAL team depending on her skills and judgment. The weight of that responsibility was enormous, but for the first time since receiving her call sign, she felt truly ready to carry it. Mike appeared at the side of her aircraft just before she was scheduled to start her engines. For a moment, the two pilots looked at each other without speaking, the weight of their complicated history hanging between them. "Martinez," he said finally, his voice lacking its usual mocking tone, "bring everyone home safe." Sarah nodded. "That's the plan." As Mike walked away, Sarah realized that something fundamental had changed. She was no longer trying to prove herself worthy of respect. She was simply going to do her job with the skills and determination she had always possessed. Sticky 6 was about to show the world what she was really made of. The flight to Afghanistan took 18 hours with 2 refueling stops, giving Sarah plenty of time to review the mission parameters and study the terrain around their target. She had downloaded every available satellite image and topographical map of the area, creating a mental picture so detailed that she could navigate the approach in complete darkness. Her crew used the long flight to check and double-check their equipment, knowing that mechanical failures in enemy territory could be fatal. The forward operating base in Helmand Province was a stark reminder of the realities of combat. Surrounded by blast walls and razor wire, the small outpost buzzed with constant activity as soldiers, Marines, and special operations forces prepared for missions or returned from them. The smell of diesel fuel, dust, and military-issue food permeated everything, creating an atmosphere that was both familiar and foreign to Sarah's peacetime experience. Chief Masters and his SEAL team were waiting when Sarah's helicopter touched down on the dusty landing pad. Masters was a compact man in his late 30s with sun-weathered skin and eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. His team consisted of 6 operators, each carrying enough equipment to sustain themselves through a prolonged firefight if necessary. "Captain Martinez, I presume," Masters said as Sarah climbed down from her aircraft. "Heard good things about you from Colonel." Sarah appreciated that he used her name rather than her call sign. Word traveled fast in the military, and she was certain that everyone on the base had heard about Sticky 6 by now. "Chief, my crew and I are ready when you are. How do you want to handle the insertion?" "Fast and quiet," Masters replied without hesitation. "Get us on the ground, give us our 60 seconds, and then pull back to a safe distance. If things go according to plan, we'll have our package and be ready for extraction within 20 minutes. "And if things don't go according to plan?" Masters smiled grimly. "Then we'll need you to come get us out of whatever mess we've gotten ourselves into." The briefing with local intelligence officers painted a picture of a heavily defended compound with an unknown number of hostile forces. Recent drone surveillance had identified at least 12 armed guards, but there could be more inside the buildings. The journalist they were rescuing had been captured 3 weeks earlier while investigating reports of civilian casualties in the area. "The good news is that they're keeping her alive," the intelligence officer explained. "The bad news is that they've moved her twice since the initial capture, which suggests they know we're looking for her." Sarah studied the latest reconnaissance photos, noting changes in the guard positions since the original mission planning. The enemy was adapting their security, which meant the rescue team would need to be prepared for surprises. At 2300 hours, Sarah began her pre-flight inspection one final time. The night air was cool and dry, with clear skies that would provide excellent visibility for the mission. Her crew moved with quiet efficiency, understanding that the next few hours would test everything they had trained for. Appeared at her shoulder as she checked the oil levels in the main rotor gearbox. "Captain, I've been thinking about something Chief Masters said earlier." "What's that, Sergeant?" "He said his team needs someone they can count on to be there when things get complicated. Sounds to me like they picked the right pilot." Sarah paused in her inspection. "You really think so?" "Ma'am, I've been flying with Marine pilots for 20 years, and I've never seen anyone prepare for a mission the way you have. Whatever happens tonight, we're as ready as we can possibly be." The SEAL team arrived at the aircraft precisely at midnight, moving like shadows across the darkened flight line. They loaded their equipment with practiced efficiency and settled into positions that would allow them to exit the helicopter quickly once they reached the target. Chief Masters took the seat directly behind Sarah, where he could communicate with her throughout the approach. "Sticky 6, this is Overwatch," came the voice of the mission controller over Sarah's headset. "You are cleared for takeoff. Weather is clear, winds light and variable. Target area remains quiet with normal patterns of movement." Sarah ran through her final instrument checks and engaged the rotor system. The familiar whine of the engines and the rhythmic thump of the rotor blades filled the cabin as the CH-53E lifted off into the night sky. The flight to the target area took 45 minutes, following a carefully planned route that avoided known enemy positions and kept them clear of areas where they might encounter unexpected ground fire. Sarah flew at an altitude of 200 feet, high enough to clear most obstacles, but low enough to avoid detection by radar systems. As they approached the initial point for their final approach, Sarah felt her heart rate increase. This was it, the moment when all of her training and preparation would be put to the ultimate test. The compound appeared on her night vision display as a cluster of heat signatures surrounded by cooler areas that indicated walls and other structures. 2 minutes to landing zone," she announced over the internal communication system. "Copy 2 minutes, Masters replied. "Team is ready." The approach to the landing zone required Sarah to fly through a narrow valley between two, using the terrain to mask their presence until the last possible moment. The helicopter's engines echoed off the rocky walls as she descended toward the small clearing that would serve as their insertion point. 30 seconds, Sarah called out, her hands steady on the controls despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The landing zone appeared ahead of them, a small patch of level ground approximately 100 meters from the target compound. Sarah could see the buildings clearly now, along with the guards moving along predetermined patrol routes. Everything looked exactly as it had in the reconnaissance photos, which was both reassuring and concerning. The enemy might be maintaining normal patterns to avoid suspicion. 10 seconds, Sarah brought the helicopter into a hover 3 feet above the ground, close enough for the SEALs to jump out, but not so low that the rotor wash would create excessive dust clouds. The team moved with incredible speed, flowing out of the aircraft like water and disappearing into the darkness within seconds. "Team is away," Masters reported over the radio, "moving to target." Sarah immediately pulled the helicopter up and moved to a holding position approximately half a mile from the compound. From here, she could monitor the team's progress and respond quickly if they needed emergency extraction. The next 20 minutes were among the longest of Sarah's life. She maintained a slow orbit of the area, watching for any signs of enemy activity while monitoring multiple radio frequencies for updates from the SEAL team. And Williams kept constant watch for threats, their weapons ready to engage any hostile forces that might appear. "Sticky 6, this is Neptune," Chief Master's voice crackled over the radio, using the team's call sign for the mission. "Package is secure, ready for extraction." Sarah felt a surge of relief. The first part of the mission had gone according to plan. "Neptune, this is Sticky 6, inbound to primary extraction point." But as she banked toward the landing zone, Williams suddenly called out from his position at the door gun. "Movement on the to the north. Looks like vehicles approaching the compound." Sarah immediately altered course to get a better view of what Williams had spotted. Through her night vision, she could see 3 trucks moving rapidly toward the compound on a dirt road that hadn't appeared in any of their intelligence briefings. "Neptune, be advised you have enemy reinforcements approaching from the north. 3 vehicles, approximately 2 minutes from your position." "Copy, Sticky 6. We're moving to the extraction point now." Sarah pushed the helicopter to maximum speed as she descended toward the landing zone. The SEAL team would be exposed and vulnerable during the extraction, and the approaching enemy vehicles would arrive right in the middle of the process. As she flared the helicopter for landing, Sarah could see muzzle flashes from the compound. The SEAL team was engaged in a running firefight as they moved toward the extraction point with their rescued journalist. The enemy reinforcements had arrived faster than expected and were already deploying to cut off the team's escape route. "Neptune, you've got hostiles moving to surround the LZ, reported over the radio. "We're almost there," Masters replied, his voice tight with concentration. 30 seconds. That's when everything went wrong. A rocket-propelled grenade streaked out of the darkness and exploded just 50 meters from Sarah's helicopter, showering the aircraft with rocks and debris. The explosion was close enough to rock the helicopter violently and trigger multiple warning lights on her instrument panel. "Taking fire," Williams called out as he returned fire with his door gun. "RPG teams in the rocks to the east." Sarah fought to maintain control of the aircraft as more enemy fire erupted from multiple directions. The SEAL team had walked into a trap, and now everyone's lives depended on her ability to get them out of an increasingly desperate situation. This was the moment that would define not just the mission, but everything Sarah Martinez had worked for in her military career. Sticky 6 was about to discover exactly what she was made of. The second RPG missed by mere meters, its explosion lighting up the night sky and revealing the true scope of the ambush. Enemy fighters were positioned in a semicircle around the landing zone, having anticipated the rescue attempt and prepared accordingly. Sarah's helicopter was caught in the middle of what had become a deadly crossfire, with the SEAL team still fighting their way toward the extraction point. "Sticky 6, we need immediate extraction." Master's voice carried the strain of combat as automatic weapons fire echoed in the background. "We're taking heavy contact from multiple directions." Sarah's training took over as her conscious mind processed the tactical situation with crystalline clarity. The primary landing zone was compromised, but the SEAL team was committed to reaching it. The alternative zones were too far away to reach under fire, and attempting to abort now would leave the team stranded in enemy territory. That left only one option. Sarah would have to land in the middle of the firefight and trust her crew to suppress enough enemy fire to allow the SEALs to board the helicopter. "Williams, I need you to lay down suppressing fire on the eastern ridge," she ordered over the internal communication system. "I'm taking us into the LZ." "Ma'am, that's a hot zone," replied. "We'll be sitting ducks on the ground." "Then we better make sure we're not sitting for very long." Sarah dropped the helicopter toward the landing zone with a controlled crash that would have terrified most passengers, but was exactly what the situation required. She used the aircraft's bulk to shield the SEAL team's approach route, while Williams opened up with his door gun, sending streams of tracer rounds toward the enemy positions. The helicopter touched down hard, bouncing once before settling onto the rocky ground. Immediately, enemy fire intensified as the fighters realized the rescue aircraft was committed to the landing zone. Bullets pinged off the helicopter's armored hull, while larger weapons sought to find vulnerable spots in the engine compartments. "Neptune team, boarding now?" Masters called out as his SEAL operators sprinted toward the helicopter, carrying both their rescued journalist and a wounded team member who had taken shrapnel from one of the earlier explosions. Sarah kept the engines at full power, ready to lift off the moment everyone was aboard. She could feel the helicopter shuddering under the impact of enemy fire, and warning lights were beginning to illuminate across her instrument panel. They had seconds, not minutes, before the aircraft would become too damaged to fly. "Contact rear," Williams shouted as he swung his weapon toward a new threat approaching from behind the helicopter. A group of enemy fighters had flanked their position and were now rushing toward the aircraft with assault rifles and what appeared to be demolition charges. Opened up with his crew-served weapon from the opposite door, creating a devastating field of fire that forced the attacking fighters to seek cover. The noise inside the helicopter was deafening as 3 different weapons fired simultaneously while the engines screamed at maximum power. "Six up," Masters called out, indicating that all of his team members and the rescued journalist were aboard the helicopter. Sarah didn't wait for a formal boarding confirmation. She pulled the helicopter into a climbing turn that put maximum distance between them and the enemy positions as quickly as possible. The aircraft groaned under the stress, and she could hear unusual noises from the rotor system that suggested they had sustained significant damage. "We're hit," called out. "Hydraulic leak in the main system." Sarah checked her hydraulic pressure gauges and confirmed assessment. They were losing fluid rapidly, which would eventually result in a complete loss of flight controls. She had perhaps 15 minutes to get the helicopter back to friendly territory before they would be forced to make an emergency landing. "How's our passenger?" she asked over the intercom. "Journalist is shaken but uninjured," Masters reported. "One of my operators has shrapnel wounds, but he's stable." The rescued journalist was a woman in her early 30s who had clearly endured weeks of captivity but remained alert and oriented. She clutched a small notebook that she had somehow managed to keep hidden from her captors, containing notes about the story she had been investigating when she was captured. The flight back to the forward operating base tested every skill Sarah had developed as a pilot. The damaged hydraulic system made the helicopter increasingly difficult to control, requiring constant adjustments to maintain level flight. She had to compensate for the mechanical failures while navigating through mountainous terrain in complete darkness, all while knowing that enemy forces were likely tracking their movement. "Sticky 6, this is Overwatch," came the voice of the mission controller. "We're tracking your return flight. Medical team is standing by for your wounded personnel." "Copy, Overwatch. We have 1 wounded friendly and 1 recovered journalist. Also be advised we have significant mechanical damage and may require emergency landing procedures." "Understood, Sticky 6. Emergency crews are being positioned now." 15 minutes from the base, the hydraulic system finally failed completely. Sarah suddenly found herself flying a machine that weighed as much as a small building with no power-assisted controls. Every input required enormous physical strength, and maintaining altitude became a constant battle against the aircraft's tendency to descend. "Ma'am, I can take the controls if you need a break," offered, though they both knew that switching pilots at this point would be more dangerous than continuing with the current arrangement. "I've got it, Sergeant. Just talk me through the emergency procedures for hydraulic failure landing." Read through the checklist while Sarah struggled to maintain control of the increasingly unresponsive helicopter. Each procedure had to be modified to account for their mechanical limitations, requiring improvisation that could only come from thorough understanding of the aircraft systems. The base appeared ahead of them like a beacon in the darkness, its landing lights cutting through the night sky. Sarah could see emergency vehicles positioned around the landing pad, ready to respond if the landing went badly. "All stations, this is Sticky 6 on final approach. Emergency landing procedures in effect." The landing was unlike anything Sarah had ever attempted. Without hydraulic assistance, she had to use pure physical strength to control the helicopter's descent, fighting against mechanical systems that seemed determined to crash them into the ground. The aircraft came down hard and bounced twice before finally settling onto the landing pad with a tremendous crash that sent sparks flying from the damaged landing gear. "Shutdown complete," Sarah called out as she secured the engines and rotor system. Medical personnel swarmed the helicopter, helping the wounded SEAL operator and ensuring that received immediate medical attention. Chief Masters paused at Sarah's position before leaving the aircraft. "Captain, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen flying like what you just did. Thank you for bringing us home." Sarah nodded, too exhausted to speak. She had successfully completed the most challenging mission of her career, but more importantly, she had brought everyone home alive. The next morning, word of the mission's success had spread throughout the base. Sarah was completing her post-flight paperwork when Mike appeared in the maintenance hangar. For a moment, the two pilots looked at each other without speaking. "Heard about last night," Mike said finally. "That was some impressive flying." "Thank you." "I owe you an apology, Martinez. I've been acting like an ass because I was threatened by someone who's a better pilot than I am." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing Mike's words. "We all have different strengths. The important thing is that we support each other when it matters." Mike nodded and extended his hand. "Friends." "Friends." Later that day, Colonel called Sarah to his office for a formal debriefing. The mission had been deemed a complete success, with the journalists safely recovered and valuable intelligence gathered about enemy operations in the area. "Captain Martinez," said as he reviewed her written report, "your performance last night was exceptional. I'm recommending you for a Distinguished Flying Cross." Sarah felt a surge of pride, but something else was bothering her. "Sir, about my call sign." Looked up from the paperwork with a slight smile. "What about it?" "Well, sir, I was wondering if you could tell me why you chose Sticky 6 specifically." Leaned back in his chair. "Captain, that call sign wasn't chosen as a joke or an insult. It was chosen because of something I observed about you during your first month with this squadron." Sarah waited for him to continue. "During a particularly difficult training exercise, when other pilots were ready to abort due to weather conditions, you stuck with the mission. When your crew chief was having family problems and requested a transfer, you stuck with him and helped him work through his issues. When Captain was making your life difficult, you stuck to your principles and continued performing at the highest level." Sarah felt her understanding of the past few months shift entirely. "Sticky 6 doesn't mean you get stuck in bad situations, Captain. It means that when everyone else gives up or runs away, you stick around and get the job done. Last night, when any reasonable pilot would have aborted the mission and left that SEAL team to find their own way out, you stuck with them and brought everyone home safe." Stood up and moved to the window overlooking the flight line. "In my experience, Captain, there are worse things to be known for than loyalty, persistence, and the refusal to abandon the people counting on you." As Sarah left's office, she felt a profound sense of completion. For months, she had been fighting to prove herself worthy of respect and acceptance. Now she realized that she had always possessed the qualities that mattered most. She had simply needed the courage to embrace them. That evening, Sarah sat in the squadron bar with Williams and several other crew members, celebrating the successful mission. When Mike arrived with his own crew, there was no tension or hostility in the air. Instead, there was the easy camaraderie of professionals who had found mutual respect. "Hey, Sticky 6, Mike called out as he approached their table. "Let me buy you a drink." Sarah looked up at him with a genuine smile. "Thanks, Thunder, I'll take you up on that." For the first time since arriving at the squadron, Sarah felt truly at home. Sticky 6 was no longer a burden to be carried. It was a badge of honor that represented everything she valued most about being a Marine pilot. She had stuck with her crew, stuck with her mission, and stuck with her principles, even when doing so required extraordinary courage and skill. The rescued journalist published her story 3 weeks later. In it, she described her rescue and specifically mentioned the extraordinary skill and bravery of the pilot who had risked everything to bring her home. She wrote about a Marine captain who had flown into a deadly ambush and fought her way back out through sheer determination and exceptional flying ability. The article never mentioned call signs or specific names, but everyone who read it knew exactly who she was writing about. Sticky Six had become more than just a pilot's nickname. It had become a symbol of what the Marine Corps stood for at its very best. Sarah Martinez had finally found her place in the brotherhood of Marine aviators, not by changing who she was, but by fully embracing the qualities that had always made her special. In a profession where reputation meant everything, she had earned hers through courage, skill, and an unwavering commitment to bringing everyone home safe. The call sign that had once seemed like a mockery had become a source of pride, not just for Sarah, but for everyone who served alongside her. Sticky Six was exactly the kind of pilot you wanted on your wing when the mission got complicated and the stakes were life and death. And in the end, that was the only reputation that really mattered.